My name is Wyatt Dalton, and for most of my life, I believed in minding my own business. I'm the kind of guy who keeps his head down, pays his taxes, trims his lawn every Sunday, and waves to the mailman out of habit. My house sits quietly on a patch of green in the outskirts of Ashford, a small town tucked away in northern Oregon. It's peaceful out here, or at least it used to be. My land isn't fancy. 2 acres, modest house, and a backyard that slopes down toward the edge of what used to be a thick cluster of pine trees. I'd bought this land over 20 years ago when it was little more than a neglected patch of overgrowth and scattered gravel. I worked every inch of it myself, hauling rocks, planting grass, even setting up a little garden where I grew tomatoes and peppers in the summer. So, when the new neighbor moved in, I didn't think much of it. The property next door had been on the market for a while, and I was glad someone was finally fixing up the place. I even baked banana bread for the family, like my mom taught me to do when welcoming someone new. I walked over one morning, knocked on their massive oak door, and introduced myself. A man answered, slick hair, fake smile, and a handshake that said, "I'm richer than you, and I want you to know it." His name was Chad Whitmore, and he had just relocated from California after making a fortune in commercial real estate. His wife barely waved at me from their front steps, sunglasses on, coffee in hand. I handed over the bread, smiled politely, and walked back to my house. The first few weeks were fine, aside from the construction noise. Chad was rebuilding the entire property. New fencing, upgraded patio, and even a fountain out front. His workers came and went like clockwork, and giant trucks lined the narrow country road day after day. I didn't complain. After all, everyone's allowed to settle in their own way. But things started to turn strange one afternoon when I was mowing the lawn near the edge of my property. That's when I noticed the fence. It wasn't the old one I had shared with the last neighbor. The wooden slats were new, and oddly enough, they were a good 6 feet into my land. I stopped the mower, wiped my brow, and stared at it. At first I thought I'd misjudged the boundary line, but I knew this land like the back of my hand. I had personally marked those lines years ago with the surveyor when I installed a drainage system along the border. That fence wasn't just close to the line, it crossed it. I stood there for a good minute, just staring at the new posts in disbelief. Then I took a photo. A few days later, I tried to talk to Chad about it. Politely, of course. I knocked on his door, same as before, and told him there must have been some mistake with the fence installation. He didn't even let me finish. "You sure about that, old man?" he asked with that arrogant smirk of his. "Pretty sure the survey said otherwise. But hey, if you want to hire someone to recheck, go ahead. Just don't waste my time." Then he shut the door in my face. That's when I knew this wasn't a mistake. This was a message, and I wasn't about to let it slide. The thing about living in a small town is people notice everything and say nothing. It's a code. Everyone values their peace and privacy, which makes it easy for someone like Chad Whitmore to assume no one will challenge him. But I wasn't raised to roll over. The morning after that conversation, I stood at the edge of the new fence, coffee in one hand, property deed in the other. I reread the boundaries, the exact measurements, every coordinate. I pulled up the original survey on my old laptop and confirmed it down to the decimal. No doubt about it, Chad had swallowed up nearly 2,500 square feet of my land. I called a local surveyor named Ken Hill. We'd worked together when I first bought the land, and I knew he was one of the best around. He drove in 2 days later with his crew, rechecked every inch, and confirmed what I already knew. "You're right," Ken said, squinting at the orange markers he'd just planted. "He's taken 6 feet down the entire length. That's no mistake, Wyatt. That's deliberate." I nodded slowly. I figured, "You want to take this to court?" I shook my head. "Not yet. I could have called a lawyer that very day. I could have gone public, made noise, brought attention to the theft. But Chad didn't deserve the satisfaction of seeing me rattle. He wanted a fight. He wanted to flex his money, his power. I wouldn't give him that luxury. Instead, I started documenting. Photos, videos, voice memos, every time his workers encroached, every delivery truck that rolled past the survey markers. I logged timestamps. I even installed a small drone camera and flew it over the property line a few times each week. Then I dug into Chad's business. Turns out he wasn't just some retired mogul with a fat wallet. He was still actively flipping properties under a shell company out of Sacramento. And he was in the middle of a deal, a major one. I found public records showing he'd staked millions on rezoning farmland near the southern edge of town. He'd leveraged loans against that deal. Big loans. If that deal fell through, he'd be holding a very expensive bag. Now I knew what kind of man I was dealing with. One who didn't just want more land, he needed it. Maybe for leverage. Maybe to impress his investors. But he wasn't about to risk anything that might shake his house of cards. And that gave me leverage. Real leverage. I didn't say a word to Chad. I let him enjoy his stolen fence, his smug lawn parties, his wine nights by the fire pit. Let him think he'd gotten one over on the quiet neighbor with dirt under his nails and calluses on his hands. Meanwhile, I was building a case so airtight it could suffocate him. And I knew exactly when to strike. Christmas was coming. And if Chad Whitmore thought the snow would cover up what he did, he was in for a very cold surprise. December rolled in with early frosts and the scent of pine in the air. Our quiet little neighborhood twinkled with string lights and inflatable reindeer. Chad's mansion looked like something out of a winter magazine, every inch of his new fence strung with LEDs, wreaths on every window, and a garland-covered arch framing his driveway. It was as if he wanted the whole town to see what he'd built. But while the town admired his lights, I watched his empire from the shadows. Ken, the surveyor, had completed his second report. This one was notarized, stamped and filed with the county. I'd also spoken with a real estate attorney who specialized in property disputes, a no-nonsense woman named Gloria Ruiz, who had one of the sharpest minds I'd ever seen in action. She reviewed the documents I'd gathered and looked at me over her glasses. "Mr. Barrett," she said, "this isn't just a fence issue. This is a textbook case of encroachment with financial implications. If he's using your land to raise property value or secure lending, he's breaking serious laws. You have a strong case." Ironclad. I nodded. "I don't want a lawsuit. Not yet. I want options. Quiet options." Gloria smiled. "I'll make a call." And that's when things really started to move. Turns out, Chad's new mansion wasn't entirely up to code. His expansion had pushed his footprint dangerously close to zoning violations. With the stolen land, he had enough buffer. Without it, he was in violation on 3 counts. Add in a few whispers in the right departments, and a full review was triggered by the city's planning commission. Meanwhile, I stayed quiet. When Chad waved at me from his porch a few days before Christmas, I smiled and waved back. He was dressed in a crimson sweater, holding a glass of whiskey. "Hope you like the lights," he called across the street. I figured I'd give this neighborhood a bit of class. I tipped my hat. "Sure looks fancy." Inside, I was gritting my teeth. But patience was the name of the game. I didn't need to explode. I needed to erode him. And erosion takes time. Christmas Eve arrived. The whole neighborhood gathered for a potluck in the community center. I baked an old family recipe, cornbread with honey glaze, and made my rounds. Smiles, handshakes, laughter. When Chad showed up with his designer coat and imported cheese plate, folks welcomed him, but I could tell the shine was starting to fade. A few had already heard whispers about zoning issues, the first cracks in his armor, and then came the letter. It arrived 2 days after Christmas, hand-delivered to Chad's door. Official county stationery. Inside was a formal notice. His building permit was under review, and until resolved, no further development could continue. The kicker? If found in violation, he'd have to remove all construction that extended beyond his property line, including the fence. The very same fence he gloated about. I watched from my porch as he tore open the envelope. I saw his expression shift from arrogance to confusion, then to panic. He paced his driveway for a full 10 minutes, phone glued to his ear, his jaw clenched, his forehead reddened, and I just stood there, sipping my coffee. The game had shifted, and it was only the beginning. The morning after Chad received that county letter, his property turned quiet, eerily quiet. No more contractors banging around with ladders, no landscapers grooming his imported hedges. The house that once buzzed with renovation was now a silent, frozen monument. I kept to my porch, sipping coffee, pretending to read the paper while keeping one eye on the storm brewing across the street. By noon, I saw Chad stomp out to his driveway, phone pressed to his ear, pacing like a man whose world was unraveling thread by thread. He shouted into the receiver, occasionally throwing his hands in the air in disbelief. That confidence he used to wear like a crown, gone, replaced by the nervous energy of a man who knew his kingdom sat on a fault line. Then, as if summoned by his panic, a sleek black SUV pulled up to his driveway. A man in a navy suit stepped out, clipboard in hand, face expressionless. He was from the city's zoning department, no doubt. They spoke for nearly 20 minutes before Chad's voice rose so high, I could hear it from my porch. "You think I'll just rip it out? Are you kidding me? I spent nearly 50 grand on that line of fence." The inspector didn't flinch. He simply pointed to the boundary markers and held out a pen for Chad to sign the acknowledgement form. Chad refused, of course. He threw his pen down like a child denied dessert. But whether he signed or not didn't matter. The city had already filed the enforcement review. Later that afternoon, Chad came over. No arrogance in his walk this time, just a stiff posture, trying to play it cool. "Hey there, neighbor," he said, forced smile in place. "Funny thing, huh? City says there might have been a mix-up on the property lines." I asked, feigning confusion. "That's strange. I had my land resurveyed last month, just to be sure. Turns out that fence of yours is a good 6 feet deep into my land." He blinked. 6 feet? Come on, who's gonna notice 6 feet? "I noticed," I replied evenly. "And so did the county." There was a long pause before he tried to backpedal. "Look, maybe we can work something out. You know, I could rent the space, just temporarily. You want to rent the land you stole?" I raised an eyebrow. "Interesting proposal." He laughed nervously. "I didn't steal anything. It was the contractor. They said the lines were right. How was I supposed to know?" "You could have asked," I said. And with that I turned and walked inside, leaving him standing there in his designer loafers and an ever-growing pool of consequences. That night I received a call from Gloria Ruiz. "Dale," she said, I think you'll enjoy this." She forwarded an email, a scanned copy of a request Chad had submitted to the zoning board. In it he begged for an exemption, claiming he had no knowledge of the encroachment, and pleaded for leniency due to personal investment and reputation in the neighborhood. Gloria's email ended with a note: "Denied. The city's not playing favorites." The walls were beginning to close in on Chad, and I wasn't even halfway done. I wasn't looking for payback in fire and fury. I wanted collapse by exposure, an unraveling slow enough for him to feel every thread pull loose. The next phase of my plan was about to begin, and it was going to sting far more than any fence ever could. It was funny, really. All those years I kept to myself, mowed my lawn, paid my taxes, and never made waves. I wasn't the neighbor who brought over casseroles or hosted backyard barbecues, but I sure as hell wasn't a troublemaker. Yet here I was, systematically dismantling a man who thought respect could be bought and decency skipped. Chad had no idea just how deep my roots went in this community. A week after the zoning department denied his request, demolition notices started showing up on his mailbox. His contractor vanished without a trace, probably didn't want to be liable for any of it. Then came the fine $500 a day for every day that the fence remained in violation. Chad tried to play smart. He removed the outer fence panels but left the posts embedded. "It's temporary," he claimed. "Just fixing what I need to." But those concrete footings still trespassed onto my property, and the city wasn't in the mood for games. Meanwhile, I kept working behind the scenes. Using the Freedom of Information Act, I pulled zoning applications and construction permits. Turns out, Chad hadn't just violated the fence line. His new patio, complete with outdoor kitchen and fireplace, had also exceeded lot boundaries. The blueprint he submitted to the city, it didn't match what he actually built. Bingo. I handed everything to Gloria Ruiz in a tidy little binder. She reviewed it with a sigh and said, "Looks like Chad's gonna have a real bad quarter." It didn't take long before the city slapped him with a stop work order on the entire project. The patio was deemed an unpermitted structure, which not only halted his backyard dreams, it triggered a review of his entire property tax assessment. By now the neighborhood was buzzing. Some folks watched from their windows, others took long walks past his house just to get a glimpse of the wreckage. I heard whispers at the grocery store. "Did you hear what happened to the guy at 341? Thought he was untouchable." Chad started keeping his blinds shut, and his Range Rover parked in the garage instead of the driveway. I'd be lying if I said I didn't enjoy it. Watching him squirm under the weight of his own arrogance felt like justice served. But I wasn't done yet. I knew from a casual chat at a homeowners meeting months ago that Chad had recently started a real estate investment company. Very flashy, very ambitious. I also knew that he used the mansion as collateral on a major loan. So I dug into public records and found the lien holder. It was a small private equity group based in Colorado. I drafted a letter attaching all the official notices, citations and stop work orders Chad had received over the last 2 months. I phrased it carefully, letting them know the asset securing their investment was under active municipal enforcement and facing potential devaluation due to non-compliance. It was surgical and devastating. 2 weeks later, a real estate broker called to schedule a viewing. Chad's property was being appraised, under pressure from his own lenders. He was hemorrhaging money, and the illusion of control he once wielded was evaporating. He had messed with the wrong neighbor. The game wasn't over yet, but the board was tipping in my favor, and Chad, he was finally starting to realize just how far he'd overstepped. The morning I found Chad pacing in his driveway, yelling into his phone, I knew the pressure had finally cracked him. His suit jacket was wrinkled, his tie hanging loose around his neck, and his voice, usually smug and composed, was wild with desperation. "No, I told you, I'll get it cleared up. It's just a misunderstanding." He didn't even notice me stepping out to get the mail. Not that I expected him to. The Chad I knew rarely noticed anyone unless they were important or an obstacle. The city had already issued its final warning: remove all structures in violation within 10 days or face forced demolition at the owner's expense. His fancy pergola, his outdoor kitchen, his stone fireplace, it was all on borrowed time. And to make matters worse, I'd discovered he'd skipped over a critical inspection during construction. One anonymous tip to the building department later, and that can of worms was open too. Word was spreading fast now. Real estate agents whispered about pending litigation. Bankers got jittery. His social circle, other investors and country club friends, started ghosting him. No one wanted to be attached to a sinking ship. And that's exactly what his mansion was becoming, a beautifully landscaped, sun-drenched, marble-countered disaster. One evening, I saw a woman, likely his wife or girlfriend, storming out with 2 suitcases. She didn't yell. She didn't cry. She just threw her bags in a waiting Uber and left. That must have been the final blow. The very next morning, a for sale by owner sign appeared out front. But the listing price was laughably high. He was trying to cover his debt, legal costs, and still make a profit. Everyone could smell the desperation. A week later, I got a knock on my door. It was Chad. He looked different, deflated, hollowed out. The confident, chest-thumping alpha male had vanished. In his place stood a man who had tasted his own medicine and found it bitter. "Listen," he began, his voice dry. "I just want to say, I didn't mean for things to go this far." I raised an eyebrow. "You mean building illegally on my land, falsifying permits? Or was it when you laughed in my face and said I couldn't do a thing about it?" He swallowed. "I was under pressure. Business stuff. The market tanked and save it," I said coldly. "You crossed a line. Not just once. And now you're paying the price." He hesitated, then said something that actually caught me off guard. "You're right. No excuses. No groveling. Just those 2 words." And then he turned, walked back down my driveway, and disappeared into what was left of his pride. For a moment, I stood frozen. Not because I pitied him, but because I realized something. I didn't need to gloat. I didn't need to destroy what was already falling apart. His own arrogance had done the job. I'd simply cleared the path. 2 weeks later, a low rumble woke me just before dawn. I opened my blinds to see a crew of trucks, bulldozers and demolition contractors lined up along the street, like soldiers waiting for command. The city hadn't just followed through, they'd brought out the big guns. By 9 a.m., Chad's mansion wasn't just being condemned, it was being erased. Walls crumbled, dust filled the air. Marble countertops and luxury windows shattered under the weight of heavy machinery. A treehouse that had once been built for show toppled like a fallen ego. I stepped outside and leaned on my fence. The fence I had legally, properly, and patiently waited to restore. Several neighbors gathered too. Nobody said much, but the air buzzed with quiet justice. Someone whispered, "Guess money doesn't buy you brains." Another murmured, "Or respect." I didn't comment. I just watched as the same man who once gloated over his custom-built patio now stood behind a yellow caution line, helpless, his hands on his head. Chad had fought everyone, inspectors, surveyors, me, and lost. Once the last wall fell, I walked back inside and called a local fencing company, the one Chad had tried to undercut. "Morning," I said. "I think it's time we finish the job. Let's talk about putting my original fence back where it belongs." They came the next day, and when they were done, I had not only reclaimed my land, I'd reclaimed my peace. That night, I walked the perimeter of my yard under the glow of the porch light. Each step along the newly restored boundary felt like a chapter closing. I wasn't angry anymore. I wasn't even smug. I was just free. I poured myself a glass of sweet tea, sat on the porch, and looked out at the open space Chad once tried to steal. There was something poetic about it. He'd tried to fence me in, but in the end, it was his own world that collapsed. And me, I still had my home, my values, and every square inch of the land that was rightfully mine. A week after the demolition, I received a thick envelope from the county's legal department. Inside was a final ruling confirming the permanent revocation of all zoning approvals Chad had once secured through manipulation and false documentation. The report spelled it out in black and white: zoning fraud, encroachment, bribery allegations under investigation, and a formal citation for improper property development. But what stood out most was a single line: the property formerly located at 428 Brookdale Lane is deemed unsuitable for reconstruction without a full legal reassessment. Translation: Chad couldn't rebuild. That land would sit empty until he cleared every legal obstacle, which could take years. I tucked the envelope into a folder labeled Peace, smiled, and turned my attention to something I'd ignored for too long: living. I started planting again: lavender, hydrangeas, and a small vegetable garden that reminded me of my late wife's dream. She'd always talked about canning tomatoes and making her own jam. And now, with Chad's noise, arrogance, and concrete monstrosity gone, I could finally hear the wind again. I could breathe again. One afternoon, as I was digging a trench for an irrigation line, a young couple walked by. The woman paused, staring at the empty plot next door. "Wasn't there a huge house here?" she asked. I looked up, wiped my brow, and nodded. "There was," I said. "Didn't last." She smiled, and they continued their walk. That night, I received a message on Facebook from an account I didn't recognize. It was Chad. "You ruined me," it read. "Hope you're happy." I stared at the screen for a moment, then closed the app. No need to respond. The silence would speak louder. Because this wasn't about ruining anyone. It was about justice, respect, and the quiet kind of revenge that doesn't make noise, but leaves a mark that can't be erased. Chad had taken 6 feet of my land, but in the end he lost everything. Word travels fast in small counties, and in less than 2 months, Chad's downfall had become the talk of every local cafe and neighborhood gathering. But while the gossip faded, the legal aftershocks didn't. Turns out Chad's empire was propped up by loans and bluster. Once his zoning privileges were revoked and the mansion was declared a total loss, the banks came knocking. Hard, with no occupancy permits and a massive lien placed on the land due to multiple code violations, he couldn't flip the property, rent it out, or even refinance. One day in early spring, I got a certified letter informing me that the county would be hosting a public auction. The lot next door was being seized due to unpaid debts and back taxes, nearly $300,000 worth. The auction took place in the old town hall, a dusty building with bad coffee and folding chairs. I wore my best flannel shirt and jeans, sitting quietly near the back while a handful of local developers made small talk, flipping through property assessments. When Chad's former lot came up for bidding, no one said a word. Everyone knew the mess that came with it: permits revoked, title under scrutiny, media attention. It was a poisoned chalice. I stood up. $1, I said. The auctioneer raised an eyebrow but nodded. Do I hear two? Silence. After 3 calls, the gavel came down with a sharp crack. Sold. Just like that, the land was mine. 6 months earlier, I had stood on that very ground watching bulldozers tear up my peace, my view and my dignity. Now, I owned it outright, legally, cleanly, and without ever raising my voice. Back home, I poured a glass of lemonade and sat on my porch, staring out over the now empty lot. Grass was beginning to grow again. Birds had returned to the trees, and in the soil where greed had once taken root, something better was beginning to bloom: peace. The morning sun stretched slowly across my porch as I stood with a mug of coffee in one hand and the city inspector's report in the other. My eyes scanned the final approval: unauthorized encroachment, structural violations confirmed, demolition approved. I folded the letter with care and slid it into my jacket pocket. Today wasn't just a day on the calendar, it was the reckoning I had quietly planned for months. At precisely 9 a.m., a convoy of city trucks, demolition rigs, and utility vans rolled up the hill like an army. Their engines hummed in unison. My neighbor Dennis Carrington, the same man who had arrogantly extended his mansion 6 feet onto my land, stood on his porch in a silk robe, still unaware of the storm about to blow his empire apart. He noticed the trucks, but his smirk didn't fade until the city marshal stepped out of the lead van and handed him a bright orange notice. I couldn't hear their exchange, but I didn't need to. I saw it. The exact moment confusion gave way to disbelief, and then panic. Dennis glanced in my direction, his mouth hanging open as if the words had escaped him. I raised my coffee mug in a silent salute. "Good morning," I mouthed. The demolition team wasted no time. Utility workers shut off water and electricity. Engineers laid markers across the illegally extended portions of Dennis's estate. And then came the machines. The sound of cracking concrete, splintering beams, and falling stone echoed down the neighborhood like a war drum. Dennis shouted, pleaded, even tried to call his lawyer, but the permit was airtight. I made sure of that. Every inch of evidence I had gathered, every zoning violation, every forged signature, it had all been neatly tied into a legal package weeks ago. The city couldn't ignore it, and now they weren't. Neighbors peeked from their windows, some even stepped outside with lawn chairs. After all, Dennis had made quite a few enemies over the years. He wasn't the type to keep things quiet, especially when it came to flaunting his wealth. His wife's silver Porsche had to be towed off what used to be my land. Garden sculptures were hauled away like discarded junk. The massive stone gazebo he'd built over the boundary line, gone in under 15 minutes. Dennis ran up to me at one point, furious, red-faced, and fuming like a kettle left on a burning stove. "You did this," he bellowed. "You set this up behind my back." I looked at him coolly. "You moved your fence onto my property. You ignored every warning. I just followed the law. You could have talked to me, Alex," he shouted. I shook my head. "I tried. You called it a misunderstanding. Then you laughed in my face. I don't do second warnings, Dennis." He stood there, stunned, as a wrecking ball slammed through the side of his pool house, shattering glass and tearing apart marble tiles like paper. By the afternoon, the entire extension was gone. What was left of his mansion sat awkwardly at the edge of his legal property line, amputated, reduced, and stripped of its arrogance. As the trucks pulled away and silence returned, I walked the edge of my property, the land he once tried to steal with a smirk and a shrug. The grass would grow back, the boundary markers would stay firm, and my peace, well, that was already restored. Some battles are fought with fists, others are fought with silence, patience, and a pen. I chose the latter, and I won.